Picture this. It's a Sunday afternoon. You're sitting in the cabin of a jumbo jet, engines humming, waiting to finally take off after hours of delays. You have no idea that somewhere ahead of you, hidden completely inside a wall of cloud, another 747 is accelerating toward you at nearly 200 miles per hour. Neither does its crew. In exactly 39 seconds, the deadliest accident in aviation history will happen. And the terrifying truth is, it almost didn't. In fact, there were at least a dozen moments where a single, different decision would have saved every single life. So what went so catastrophically wrong? To understand how this happened, we need to go back to the morning of March 27th, 1977. And we need to follow two very different aircraft on their way to the exact same island. The first is Am Flight 1736, a Boeing 747-100 that started its day in Los Angeles, made a stop to pick up passengers in New York, and was now heading south across the Atlantic toward Las Palmas Airport on Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands. This flight had been chartered by a cruise company, and almost every seat was filled with retired Americans, mostly elderly passengers excited to board a cruise ship at their destination. Because of a 45-minute delay back in New York, the aircraft was already running behind schedule when it lifted off from JFK at 7:42 in the morning. In command was Captain Victor Grubbs, 56 years old, a deeply experienced aviator. Beside him sat First Officer Robert Bragg, 38, and Flight Engineer George Warnes, 46. This was a tight, capable crew. They knew their aircraft, they knew their jobs, and on any normal day, this would have been a routine transatlantic leg. The second aircraft is KLM Flight 4805, another Boeing 747. This one departing Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport at exactly 9 a.m. This flight had also been chartered, this time by a Dutch travel company, and its plan was simple. Fly to Las Palmas, turn around, load new passengers, and fly straight back to Amsterdam as Flight 4806. A long day, but a manageable one. At the controls of the KLM jet sat Captain Jacob Veldhuizen van Zanten, 50 years old and arguably one of the most decorated pilots in the entire KLM fleet. He wasn't just a line captain. He was KLM's chief 747 flight instructor. His face had literally appeared in KLM magazine advertisements. He was, by every measure, the kind of pilot you wanted flying your airplane. His first officer was Klaas Meurs, who, in a small but important detail, had actually been certified on the 747 type by Van Zanten himself, just months before this flight. And his flight engineer was Willem Schroeder, a seasoned professional known among colleagues for one particular quality. He was not afraid to say what he thought out loud. Keep that in mind. So both aircraft are in the air, both heading to Las Palmas. Everything looks routine. And then, at exactly 1 o'clock in the afternoon, everything changes. Inside the terminal building at Las Palmas Airport, a desk clerk picks up a ringing phone. The voice on the other end claims to represent a group called the MPAIAC, a Canarian independence movement that had been agitating for separation from Spain throughout the 1970s, using both political campaigns and, on occasion, acts of violence. The caller announces that bombs have been planted inside the terminal, plural, and that there are 15 minutes to evacuate. 14 minutes and 50-something seconds later, almost to the second, a device hidden inside a bag near the flower shop in the terminal detonates. Part of the ceiling collapses. 4 people are wounded. The airport goes into lockdown. Now here's where it gets complicated. The caller said bombs. Authorities have to assume there's at least one more device somewhere inside the building. The entire terminal needs to be searched, and while that's happening, no flights are landing at Las Palmas. Both the KLM 747 and the Pan Am 747 are already in holding patterns above Gran Canaria when they receive word. Neither can land. Both are told the same thing. We don't know how long this will take. You need to divert. The nearest option is Los Rodeos Airport on the neighboring island of Tenerife, a 25-minute flight away. The KLM aircraft lands first at 1:38 p.m. The Pan Am aircraft follows about 37 minutes later. And suddenly, Los Rodeos, a small, underprepared regional airport, is completely overwhelmed with diverted traffic. Before we go further, it's worth understanding exactly where these aircraft have ended up, because Los Rodeos Airport is not a place you'd choose to be in a 747, especially not in bad weather. The airport sits in the northeastern corner of Tenerife, perched at roughly 2,000 feet above sea level. Tenerife is dominated by Mount Tide, the highest peak in all of Spain, and an active volcano. The mountain acts like a massive wall against the trade winds blowing in off the Atlantic. Warm, moisture-laden air hits that mountain, rises, cools, and dumps its water content, often extremely rapidly. Down in the south of the island, where the tourist resorts are, it's almost always sunny. Up at Los Rodeos in the north, you can go from clear skies to near zero visibility in under 3 minutes. This isn't ordinary fog. It's more like low cloud that rolls across the runway in patches. Sometimes visibility is 2 or 3 kilometers, and moments later it drops to 100 meters or less. There are no stable conditions to plan around. It's unpredictable in the worst possible way. And the airport's history reflected this. Between 1965 and 1968, there was roughly 1 fatal accident per year in or around Los Rodeos, collectively killing nearly 100 people. A brand new airport had actually been built in the sunnier south of the island. It was paved, ready, and equipped with modern ground radar. But political disagreements had stalled its opening. Los Rodeos, the airport that should have been replaced, had no ground radar whatsoever. Controllers could not see the runway from the tower in poor visibility. They had no way of knowing where aircraft were once they were out on the tarmac. That detail will matter enormously very soon. While the passengers from both flights waited at Los Rodeos, the 2 cockpit crews were in very different mental states. On the Pan Am aircraft, Captain Grubbs kept spirits remarkably high. He got on the intercom and invited passengers to come up and tour the flight deck. People were chatting, exploring the cockpit, making the best of an unexpected afternoon layover. Grubbs was a pilot who knew how to manage a cabin. On the KLM aircraft, the tone was completely different. Van Zanten and his crew had started doing the math. The Netherlands had recently updated its flight duty time legislation, the rules governing how many hours a crew could legally operate before being grounded. Before 1977, the regulations were relatively loose. Now they were strict, and the penalties for violation were severe. A captain found to have exceeded his legal duty hours didn't just get a fine. He could face criminal charges. He could go to jail. Van Zanten ran the numbers. If the delay at Los Rodeos stretched much longer, the window for flying to Las Palmas, turning around, and making it back to Amsterdam without breaching those limits would close entirely. His crew would be stuck overnight in Las Palmas. His wife would hear about the bombing on the news. She'd worry. He made a decision that, on the surface, was entirely logical. If they were going to sit here anyway, he would use the time to refuel the aircraft completely, topping up not just for the short hop to Las Palmas, but for the entire return leg to Amsterdam. That way, the turnaround in Las Palmas could be as fast as possible. Load the passengers, close the doors, go. Sensible, efficient, completely understandable. But here's the catch. Fueling a Boeing 747 is not a quick operation. Once you start, stopping it mid-process creates more problems than it solves. And adding that fuel would increase the aircraft's takeoff weight by roughly 15%, meaning it would need a higher rotation speed and a significantly longer runway roll to get airborne. Van Zanten had barely initiated the refueling when word came through. Las Palmas was open again. The bomb search was over. Flights could resume. Captain Grubbs on the Pan Am aircraft heard the same news. He requested engine start, but he was told to wait. The KLM jet was still refueling, and it was physically blocking the only path the Pan Am aircraft could use to reach the runway. There wasn't enough clearance to squeeze past. Not even close. They were about 20 feet short. Grubbs asked how long the refueling would take. Van Zanten replied over the radio, another 20 to 30 minutes. The Pan Am crew was stuck. By the time KLM finally finished fueling at 4:45 p.m., the weather at Los Rodeos had deteriorated dramatically. Cloud had rolled in from the hills, visibility was patchy and worsening, and the airport's apron was still clogged with diverted aircraft. At 4:56 p.m., the KLM crew had their engines running and received taxi clearance. They were told to proceed to runway 12, backtrack its full length, make a 180-degree turn at the far end, and hold there, awaiting further clearance. What followed was a sequence of small misunderstandings, each one seemingly minor, each one quietly steering the situation toward catastrophe. First, the KLM first officer misread back his taxi clearance, saying first exit when the controller had said third exit. The controller caught it and clarified, just go all the way to the end of the runway. But then Van Zanten, taxiing in poor visibility without functioning centerline lighting, twice asked his crew about turning off at intermediate exits, first at Charlie 1, then again at Charlie 4. This might reflect genuine positional uncertainty in the fog, or it might, and investigators would later consider this carefully, reflect a captain whose mind was already partly somewhere else, already thinking about Las Palmas, already calculating the duty time clock. When the Pan Am aircraft received its own taxi clearance shortly after, it was given instructions to backtrack the same runway and exit at the third turnoff on the left, Charlie 3. The crew discussed this among themselves because Charlie 3, approached from this direction, would require two extremely sharp turns, 148 degrees each, which would be essentially impossible for a 747 to execute. They suspected the controller may have actually meant Charlie 4, which offered a gentle 35-degree turnoff instead. This confusion meant the Pan Am aircraft was still on the runway, taxiing slowly through dense fog, trying to locate the correct exit, while the KLM aircraft was at the far end, completing its 180-degree turnaround and preparing to depart. At 5:03 p.m. and 29 seconds, the Pan Am first officer came on the radio and, with notable emphasis, asked the controller to confirm they were to exit at the third exit. The controller confirmed. Third exit, yes. In the KLM cockpit, the crew was listening. The cockpit voice recorder shows complete silence at that moment. The crew was paying attention to this exchange. And here, investigators believe, a critical misinterpretation may have occurred. The most likely reading is that someone in the KLM cockpit heard the Pan Am aircraft call out its upcoming exit and interpreted that as confirmation that Pan Am had already turned off the runway, that the runway ahead was clear. It wasn't. The Pan Am aircraft was still on it, about 2,000 meters away from the KLM jet, slowly rolling through fog, calling for confirmation of a taxiway it hadn't reached yet. At 5:05 p.m., First Officer Moores called ATC for departure clearance. His phrasing was ambiguous. It could be read as requesting both the routing clearance and takeoff clearance simultaneously. The controller responded with the routing clearance, the navigation instructions for after takeoff. But embedded in that clearance was the word takeoff, not as a clearance to take off, but as part of a positional description of a climb maneuver. In the mind of a pilot looking for permission to go, and who already believed the runway was clear, that word landed like a green light. Van Zanten advanced the thrust levers. Moores, still reading back the clearance, added the words, "We are now at takeoff," a phrase that to some ears meant, "We are in takeoff position," and to others meant, "We are taking off right now." The controller heard the first interpretation. He responded, "Okay," and then started to add, "Stand by, I will call you." But at that exact moment, the Pan Am crew also keyed their mic to warn that they were still on the runway. Both transmissions overlapped. The signals interfered. The only thing the KLM crew heard through their headsets was the controller's "okay," followed by a high-pitched squeal. Three things still had a chance to stop what was coming. The controller, realizing something may be wrong, called the Pan Am aircraft to confirm their runway status. Pan Am responded. They would report when clear. The KLM aircraft was now accelerating. Then flight engineer Schroeder, the man known for speaking his mind, leaned forward toward the captain and said, "Is he not clear of the runway then?" Van Zanten, deep in his takeoff role, asked him to repeat it. Schroeder asked again. Van Zanten said, with complete confidence, "Oh yes." At 5:06 p.m. and 38 seconds, 11 seconds before impact, Captain Grubbs looked through his cockpit windshield and saw two lights materializing out of the fog ahead. At first, they seemed stationary. Then they didn't. "There he is," Grubbs said. A beat. Then, "Get off, get off." He slammed his tiller hard left, trying to drag his 340-ton aircraft off the runway centerline and into the grass. He pushed his throttles forward. The aircraft had barely reached 20 knots. In the KLM cockpit, Van Zanten had just heard his V1 call, the point of no return, when the silhouette of a turning jumbo jet appeared in the fog directly ahead. He hauled back on his controls. The tail of the KLM 747 scraped the runway, gouging a 20-meter scar into the asphalt. The nose lifted. The aircraft momentarily became airborne, not high enough. The number 4 engine on the right wing of the KLM aircraft, still traveling at takeoff speed. plowed directly into the upper forward fuselage of the Pan Am jet, tearing through the first-class lounge and the upper deck. The left wing of the KLM aircraft sheared off the tail and vertical stabilizer of the Pan Am aircraft. The main landing gear of the KLM jet punched through the Pan Am fuselage like a battering ram. The KLM aircraft continued airborne for another 150 meters before settling back onto the runway. Without its landing gear, which had been ripped away in the collision, it slid several hundred meters, rotating slightly clockwise, and the moment it touched down, it ignited. All 248 people on board the KLM aircraft perished. There were no survivors. On the Pan Am aircraft, the cockpit crew, all three of them, survived the initial impact, but they found themselves in chaos. The flight engineer reached for the fire suppression handles above his head to shut down the engines. His hands found nothing. The entire section of cockpit roof that those handles were mounted on had been torn away. The passengers seated in the first-class cabin directly below the upper deck were killed almost instantly. Most survivors escaped not through emergency exits. The structural deformation of the aircraft had jammed most of those shut, but through jagged holes torn in the fuselage. Others climbed through gaps in the roof and slid down onto the wings. The jump to the tarmac was nearly 6 meters. Of the 396 people aboard the Pan Am aircraft, 61 survived. Total lives lost, 583. The fire on the KLM aircraft was already fully consuming the plane by the time firefighters reached it. Visibility had been so poor that the rescue crews didn't even know there were 2 aircraft involved until they drove further down the runway through the fog and found a second 747 burning. The air traffic controller, sitting in his tower with no ground radar and no line of sight, had no idea any of this had happened until another aircraft reported seeing flames from the taxiway. The Spanish investigation report placed primary blame on Captain Van Zanten for initiating takeoff without clearance, for not aborting when told to stand by, for not stopping when the Pan Am crew broadcast their position, and for overriding his own flight engineer's concern. The Dutch investigators agreed on the cause, but they went further. They wanted to understand why, how a pilot of Van Zanten's experience and reputation could have made this sequence of errors. They examined the role of flight time pressure in distorting his decision-making. They examined whether years spent as a simulator instructor, where he effectively issued his own clearances and controlled his own scenarios, may have blurred the psychological line between cleared to go and ready to go. They examined crew dynamics, language barriers, ambiguous phraseology, and the absence of the one piece of technology that might have saved everyone: ground radar. The consequences of Tenerife reshaped commercial aviation at a fundamental level. The word takeoff was removed from ATC vocabulary except in the explicit context of a takeoff clearance. Controllers now say departure when referring to any positional instruction. If you hear the word takeoff on a radio frequency, it means one thing: you are cleared to go. Nothing else. Taxiway markings became a global priority. Airports worldwide were required to improve signage and lighting so that crews in zero visibility could locate exits with certainty. Ground radar became standard at major international airports. And most significantly, the Tenerife disaster became the founding case study for crew resource management, the now universal training framework that teaches flight crews how to communicate, challenge, and override each other effectively, regardless of hierarchy. The idea that a first officer must feel empowered to stop a captain, and that a captain must genuinely listen, is now drilled into every commercial pilot's training from day one. Van Zanten's first officer did speak up. His flight engineer did ask the critical question. They were heard. They were dismissed. That moment, those 3 words, "Oh yes," spoken with absolute certainty by a man who was wrong, is now part of how we train every pilot who steps into a cockpit. 583 people, 2 aircraft, 1 afternoon, and a chain of events so dense with near misses that it almost defies belief. A bomb planted by separatists 60 miles away, a diversion to an airport notorious for bad weather, a fueling decision made under time pressure, fog that rolled in from a volcano, a clearance misread, a frequency blocked by a squeal of interference. 3 words from a flight engineer dismissed in an instant. Remove any single one of those things, and those 583 people go home. That's the brutal mathematics of disaster, and it's why this story, more than almost any other in aviation history, still matters. If you found this video interesting, consider subscribing. We go deep on the stories behind the headlines, the disasters the history books summarize in a paragraph, and the decisions that changed everything. I'll see you in the next one.